Tim, a liberal university scholarship program based on race is called out as illegal. According to the Daily Wire, an education watchdog group has filed a formal complaint with the U.S. Department of Education against the University of California, Berkeley's Environmentalist of Color scholarship program. The group, Defending Education, alleges that the scholarship, which awards $2,000 to 5 students identifying as persons of color, violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act by granting financial benefits based on race. The report quotes Defending Education's Vice President Sarah Parshall-Perry as saying the scholarship is an express federal financial benefit granted unapologetically to students on the basis of race. Eliminating race discrimination means eliminating all of it, as the Supreme Court has noted. The complaint urges the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights to investigate that program. And joining us now is an author, award-winning journalist, and founder of LibertySentinel.org, Alex Newman. Welcome back to Victory News, sir.
I lost audio.
Alex, can you hear me now?
Now I can, yes, sir.
Okay, great. What's your perspective, Alex, on Cal Berkeley's Environmentalist of Color scholarship program and Defending Education's formal complaint to the Department of Education?
Yeah, these sorts of programs are an absolute outrage on the people of the United States who pay the taxes that make these things possible. And I hope people realize this isn't just racial discrimination. There's a very insidious agenda here. In the United States, they weren't able to divide the American people based on the Marxist ideas of class, and so they picked up race as the tool to bring about that division. But as Jesus said very clearly, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. In fact, in one verse, he says it will be laid waste or brought to desolation. We don't need federally subsidized programs to divide Americans and to subsidize racial and environmental activism. So I'm very happy to see that we're moving in the right direction on this issue.
And Alex, the Bible formed the cornerstone of early American education, but you say our public schools and higher education now have been polluted by communist values and ideology, and our kids are being indoctrinated, if you will. What can parents do for their children to protect them from this?
Well, there's a lot, and I think the first and most simple thing to do is to actually pull the children out of the system. And I know that sounds radical to some people who aren't familiar with the history of how this system came to be or the fruit of it. You know, we've got data showing that the vast majority of children from Christian families who spend 12 years in these government so-called education programs are going to end up leaving the faith and leaving the church. So this is an existential crisis for the Christian community. And, you know, the pagans and the godless, they don't send their children to Christian schools. So I don't understand why so many Christians accept the idea of sending their children to pagan and godless schools. The history on this is absolutely clear. I documented extensively in my book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, endorsed by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and General Michael Flynn and Glenn Beck and Roger Stone. The history is absolutely clear on this, and we absolutely must take this seriously.
Yeah, you make some very solid points there. Now, the Trump administration has some very important talks with Iran coming up. What is at stake, in your opinion, this weekend?
Well, I think what's at stake, not to sound overly dramatic, but what's at stake here is World War III. There's a very real risk of this spiraling out of control. And so I'm grateful for the efforts that the Trump administration is taking to try to rein in the mullahs in Iran. They're very dangerous. And, of course, a lot of Americans don't realize that they're working very closely with the communist regime in Beijing, with Vladimir Putin over in Russia, and, of course, with allies around the world, including some of the jihadist terrorist groups we see operating across the Middle East and Africa. So this is a very, very important negotiation. I have full confidence that Trump will go in understanding what's going on. Whether we can trust the mullahs is a whole nother question, but the stakes here are very, very high.
Now, you wrote an eye-opening article on LibertySentinel.org on the United Nations using shipping tax for globalism. Tell us about this story.
I think this is one of the most important stories of the day, and unfortunately, there's very few people talking about it. And the little bit of debate that we are having is about who's going to pay the tax, or are Americans going to be unfairly burdened by this tax? The real issue here is far more significant. This would be the first ever tax in the history of the world imposed by the United Nations on humanity. And so whether the shipping tax is $15 per metric ton of CO2 or $150 of metric ton of CO2 is really immaterial. The story here is that the UN is plotting to impose taxes directly on humanity. Historically, if they wanted money, they had to ask governments for that money. This would liberate them from those constraints and allow them to fund whatever they want, including their peace armies, their police forces, their courts. This is a very, very serious threat to our sovereignty. So far, Trump has not said anything about it, but I'm confident that they're working on it.
Yeah, we've also heard reports that UN is funding persecutions of Christians globally. Have you heard that?
We have, absolutely. And what you see with the United Nations is this is an organization that is steeped in anti-Christian doctrines and anti-Christian worldview. And this was true all the way going back to the beginning. If you look at the key people who founded it, including our man, Al Jarhis, who was later exposed as a Soviet agent and thrown in federal prison. So very, very dangerous group.
All right, be sure to read Alex Newman's work along with his fellow journalists at libertysentinel.org. Alex, great to have you with us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Sure.